Welcome, everybody. David Lorimer apologizes he can't be here, so it is my great pleasure to be acting as chair in his place. And so I'm delighted to introduce Tim Wyatt. I have to say I've never met Tim physically, so it's a delight to meet you now, at least virtually. I'll just say a few remarks about Tim in introduction. He's a lifelong spiritual explorer, but he's also an esoteric writer. He's been a journalist, a novelist, a playwright, a film director, an actor, a musician, and even, I understand, a funeral celebrant. And I'll be interested to hear more about that, perhaps. And also, besides his books, he produces albums, musical albums, I assume that is. He's won many awards for his plays and documentaries, and he's also runs a publishing company and has a TV production business. So obviously, you're very busy, Tim, and we're delighted you've taken time out to speak to us. Now, his topic tonight is it's based on his recent book called Everyone's Book of the Dead. And I have to confess that I haven't actually read the book yet, Tim, although I read a lot about it. One disadvantage of having me instead of David Lorimer is that if it was David, he would have read the book and reviewed it by now. But in any case, as I say, I have read a lot about the book. And of course, I know that it explores the attitudes and responses to death in different cultures. Indeed, the title of the talk is A Panoramic View of Death, Dying, and the Afterstates Throughout World History. And I know your book draws on the perennial philosophy and ancient wisdoms, and it discusses mechanics of dying, post-mortem realms, reincarnation, near-death experiences, all those sorts of things which our audience is delighted to hear about. So let me also say, before asking you to start, that I know that David has recently introduced the habit of having breakout rooms. We're not going to have breakout rooms tonight. And so we will go straight into the group discussion when Tim finishes his talk. So, Tim, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome you and to invite you to give your talk. So if you could share your screen and full steam ahead.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Bernard, for those kind words, and thank you very much for everyone for joining in tonight. Can you see the screen okay? Ramo, shall I put it on full screen from the beginning, like that?
Yes, please do.
Right, fine, okay. Right, well, just a few introductory remarks. Curiously, as a human being, ever since I was a child, I've been fascinated by death. As a child, I used to go on walks with my parents on Sunday afternoons through these old churchyards, and I'd see overgrown gravestones and fallen angels and all this sort of stuff. And I'd read these epitaphs of people and noted that some people lived only for a few months or years, whereas other people lived to 80 or 90. And I asked my parents about this. I asked my priest at the church about this. I asked my teacher at school about this. And the only one who gave any response at all was the priest, who said it was God's will. And so I was left very much in the dark. But certainly, my studies of the esoteric tradition are very important because death is a central theme to this. And throughout every epoch and almost every culture without exception, they've entertained ideas of some kind of afterlife, be it a heavenly paradise of some kind or a demonic hellfire realm. And many societies and spiritual traditions viewed death very much as the start of a journey of some kind, a journey into another dimension or reality, possibly before rebirth of some kind. Now, the prevailing idea in the West amongst lots of people at the moment is that death of the physical body spells oblivion and extinction. However, this idea is becoming gradually, I think, less prevalent, and belief in reincarnation, I have to say, is making something of a comeback. A lot of people are now questioning the truths of the monotheistic religions or the apparent certainties of materialistic science. And they're looking for alternative explanations which don't deny the survival of the soul. So, what happens when we die, when our physical body ceases to work? Well, it strikes me that there are three possibilities. Option one, absolutely nothing at all. That's it. We're gone. We're finished. Option two, that we make the transition to an afterlife of some kind where we remain indefinitely and possibly forever. Or option three, that after death we move on to some kind of intermediate realm where we remain until we are reborn in a new body at some point. There may, of course, be other alternatives to this, which I've neither the knowledge nor the imagination to cook up. So, do you believe in an afterlife of some kind? Or do you believe that when you die physically, that's just the end of it and you get switched off for the last time, just like an old TV set, and then disposed of? Are you one of the many millions who think that you get just one life on Earth, even if it only lasts for a few hours or days or weeks? Is it your view that when you've finally breathed your last breath, that's the end of it all, and all that awaits is the extinction of consciousness and perception? Well, if you do subscribe to this extinction option, which I very much don't, you'll be pleased to know that all isn't lost. There's even salvation for die-hard materialists and those who are in utter denial of the spiritual realms. There's salvation providing you have sufficient wealth. If you've got a mere $200,000 to spare, you know that you can buy yourself instant immortality. When you die, your body will be gently frozen and preserved at sub-zero temperatures for many years in a secret laboratory somewhere until such time when medical science has advanced sufficiently to revive you and cure whatever it was you died from. And then, according to the marketing literature, you can just carry on where you left off. If you're a materialist on a budget, don't worry. If you have a mere $80,000, you can just opt to have your brain preserved at minus 200 degrees Celsius. And then somewhere in the future, when technology permits, this can be presumably transplanted into some kind of suitable transhumanist inspired vehicle so that you can continue your bodily existence. And for the materialist, this isn't just the only ideal afterlife, it's the only possible afterlife. And this is because for people of a purely materialistic persuasion, there's a conviction that the death of the physical body is the end of the story. For these people, death of the brain spells total obliteration of all consciousness and only some kind of oblivion awaits. And this is a widely held belief. And this is why, in my opinion, many human beings behave in the way they do. We'll deal with that later. So for the materialistically minded, life can only exist in some kind of physical form. Any other option, any invisible realms or subtle realities are unthinkable. Now, perhaps you have a more open-minded view of the post-mortem experience, and you do believe in journeying to some kind of after-death realm. If you do, what do you think it actually might look like, and how long might you stay here? For a while? Forever? Will it be pleasant? Will you commune with angels? Or will there be devils and demons or other various satanic beings to torment you? Might you have to face some kind of judgment and punishment for all the bad things that you got up to during your brief foray on planet Earth? Will you have to account for your many transgressions? Or might you be rewarded for your good deeds? Well, these ideas are tied up in most spiritual traditions in one form or another, good behavior and bad behavior, as we'll see. Will there be some kind of heaven? And if there is, will it look like this? This is what the three related Abrahamic religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism promise their followers. The simple binary options of heaven and hell, purgatory or paradise, and possibly forever. Now, Christianity talks very generally about a place called heaven, but it's all extremely vague and often vaguely contradictory. And many Christians interpret this notion of heaven literally, as in this picture, cluttering it with all sorts of cliched embellishments such as angels with harps and trumpets perched on fluffy clouds and God on his throne surrounded by winged angels and a haloed St. Peter vigilantly guarding those pearly gates to eternal bliss. And here you stay until some unspecified point in the far distant future, when Judgment Day dawns. What happens then isn't entirely clear, and there's certainly no overall agreement. Some Christians believe that the dead will be resurrected and will inhabit a new earth. And there are many versions of what precisely might happen here, depending on which of the many tens of thousands of different Christian sects you happen to belong to. And yet none of it's very specific, and I wonder whether that's somehow deliberate. Nevertheless, hundreds of millions of people around the world are convinced by these particular explanations. Other people regard them as infantile. But of course, the heavenly option in Christianity and many other spiritual traditions is only available for the worthy, for the good. The wicked and the sinful are faced with a much hotter option, miscellaneous fiery horrors in purgatory until their soul has been sufficiently purified and all evil has been exorcised. And should you fail on that particular score, then the only destination, of course, is hell, which, as all Christians know, is full of horned devils and terrifying demons, ordering you into the fiery depths of sulphurous flames where you will agonize, possibly forever. Now, Islam offers Jannah, which means paradise or sometimes garden, and it's divided into various levels, the lower ones to punish the wicked and the higher ones to reward the righteous. For the pure, it offers many physical and divine pleasures, such as spectacular gardens and, if it takes your fancy, consorting with beautiful maidens. And among the many different strands of Islam, there's no general agreement as to exactly who will end up in Jannah. Judaism also offers a similar package, although curiously, there's no exact description of heaven anywhere in the Jewish scriptures that I'm aware. Many Jews regard heaven as Gan Eden, the famed Garden of Eden, a place of light and perfection and harmony and beauty where all races will sit together until the dawning of a new messianic age. And Jews who've led sinless lives are immediately detached at this place, or more likely, as in many of these things, not so much a place as a state of consciousness. Judaism also has the equivalent of purgatory as Sheol, a place of waiting for souls needing cleansing. And it has its counterpart of hell in the form of Gehenna, a place of punishment and torment. And some Jews believe that those who've committed deeply sinful acts, such as murder, will remain in this realm forever. So we can see certain common strands running through these three Abrahamic religions. None of them now believe in reincarnation, but of course it wasn't always that way. In its early days, Christianity did preach rebirth, but abandoned this for all sorts of political and ecclesiastical reasons at the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 AD. It's an interesting story. Had Christianity retained its belief in reincarnation, how differently things may have turned out. But interestingly, as we'll see in a while, many Christians these days do believe in reincarnation. Now, in stark contrast, Eastern religions, such as the various schools of Buddhism, along with Hinduism and its different sects, are completely comfortable with the idea that humans continue to experience the wheel of life by dying and continually being reborn and occupying new bodies. And this lies at the very heart of both of these venerable traditions. Although there are beliefs that humans can be reborn as animals, members of the plant and vegetable kingdom, not a belief I would personally subscribe to. But these days, in this cynical and skeptical age in which we find ourselves, many people regard our ancestors' beliefs in an afterlife or in rebirth as somehow primitive, weird, or wacky. And it's just the stuff, they say, of myth and legend and make-believe. And they ask, how could they believe in such nonsense? But what these cynics and skeptics fail to understand is that all myths, all legends, and all folklore aren't invented like some work of fiction. They're not fictional constructs. They're nearly always based on real events, which then, of course, become elaborated and embellished with various forms of symbolism and allegory. So, legends essentially are heavily disguised truths, in my opinion, and strip away a lot of the outer trappings, and you get to the heart of what they're all about. So we have to ask here, who are the real primitives here? Our ancestors, or the modern tunneled vision skeptics with what I can only describe as spiritual paralysis? We can certainly, I believe, learn a great deal from the cultures and the spiritual beliefs of our forebears. Most of them didn't view physical death as permanent annihilation, but beginning of a new existence. And I think this is absolutely essential to understand that life is part of a continuum in and out of physical bodies. And for many, death was seen as a journey into a mysterious new world. It was also seen perhaps as an adventure or a quest and a chance to commune with gods and spirits. Now, death and afterlife were famously central to both the religious and societal beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. So much so, in fact, that life itself was organized around death. There was no belief in physical rebirth, but the Egyptians firmly believed in an afterlife, journeying through the heavens with the sun god Ra, or in the deep underworld with Osiris. You've only got to look at the architecture of Egypt to see the extent to which they put resources and money into these things. Central to the Egyptians' belief system was that a vital part of the individual remained near the body after death, and therefore that body had to be preserved and mummified in elaborate procedures. It also had to be sustained with food and drink, as well as being accompanied by furniture, games, and sometimes weaponry too. And affluent Egyptians went to absolutely extraordinary and expensive lengths to ensure the soul of a family member would make that smooth transition into the afterlife. So they mummified the dead in elaborate, lengthy, and costly embalming procedures, and also produced very ornate sarcophagi plastered with protective symbolic imagery. Personal possessions and mummified pets, especially cats, they found millions of these in Egypt, also accompanied them into the afterlife. The tombs and mausoleums, of which there are a great many, were equally ornate and mirrored the design of an Egyptian house. Some lavish edifices from the Second Dynasty even had their own toilets. Many, indeed, most of these tombs were looted by tomb raiders down the century, although Tutankhamun's grave, which was opened a century ago, was crammed with very, very expensive objects, art, and various other beautiful things. From around 2500 CE, the Egyptians regarded the soul as twofold. The first element was Ka, which was the body's spirit double, which shadowed and protected an individual through life. The second was Ba, which represented a person's individual essence. After death, Ka continued to survive in the tomb, but if the body were destroyed, neither Ka nor Ba would have anywhere to reside and therefore would have to endure a second death. Well, we now move on to the idea of judgment. Before the Egyptian journey into the afterlife, there was the final judgment conducted in the Hall of Two Truths. The heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of truth by the truth goddess Mart, who was assisted by the jackal-headed god of the dead, Anubis. Everything had to balance on Mart's scales. If it were too light or too heavy, it would be consigned to oblivion after first being eaten by the evil demon Ammit. Those passing the test were officially inducted into the afterlife by Osiris. Ba was represented as a human head combined with a bird, and in its journey to the afterlife, it traveled to the kingdom of the dead known as the Duat. For the purer-hearted, there was the higher realm of Aru, the field of reeds where they would enjoy eternity accompanying Ra on his daily journeys across the sky. But this option was reserved only for those who were correctly dressed and who could recite the requisite incantations. And add to this that this world could only be accessed by passing through gates guarded by malevolent spirit demons without looking at them. So there's a lot to go through here. The Egyptian afterlife, like most others, was an idealized mirror image of the physical world with beautiful landscapes, with crops and various deities with whom to commune. In the Egyptian mindset, social rank continued in this after-death realm, and the rich could take their wealth, their power, and their position along with them. The more elevated the life on earth, the more agreeable the afterlife. Royalty and rich merchants had their servants entombed with them so they could continue their domestic duties in the hereafter. We'll turn now to a very different tradition. The afterlife of the Celts was known as the other colourful and intriguing idea, although there are a number of different variations within the Celtic traditions. It was known as Anwen in Welsh mythology, as Avalon in the Arthurian legend, and Tir na Nog in the Irish tradition. Like the Egyptians, the Celts buried the dead with various grave goods they would need in the afterlife. For example, a warrior might be buried with his helmet and shield and sword. Others would be accompanied by food or with ornaments. As to the location of this other world, the Irish Celts imagine the afterlife as being underground or sometimes on islands in the sea. But here was a place of perfection. There was no age, sickness, death, or unhappiness of any kind. It was essentially an everlasting supernatural paradise occupied by deities and was characterized by youth and beauty, health, abundance, and joy. This realm is also visited by mythical heroes, either by chance or sometimes by being invited by one of its occupants. And it was accessed via caves, via burial mounds, waterfalls, or sometimes underwater. And sometimes these heroes found themselves there spontaneously, accompanied by a magic mist, by strange animals or supernatural beings. At other times, a beautiful otherworldly woman would entice a hero with a silver apple branch or a ball of thread to follow. In Ireland, this voyage to the other world was said to be undertaken in a glass boat, or sometimes on a chariot, or on the back of a white horse. No doubt, highly symbolic vehicles, all of them. In Irish and other tales, the hero sometimes returns to the physical realms after what he imagines is only a short time away, but to his horror, he discovers that sometimes hundreds of years have elapsed and all his companions are now dead. The Druids, very interesting people, the Celts priestly sect, but also their lawmakers and political advisors, believed that there were three circles of life and that the soul lived successively in each of these spheres. During this time, it reincarnated in all conceivable forms of matter and spirit before entering some kind of nirvana-like state and finally departing from the cycle of material existence altogether. The Buddhists are so of rebirth that they're said to have wept with regret at the birth of a child, but rejoiced heartily at death. They also believed that debts not paid in this life could be held over until the next incarnation, some kind of financial karma taking place here. Beliefs about death and the afterlife amongst the many hundreds of different Native American groups varied enormously between tribes and even within some tribes themselves. And so did the burial rites and funeral practices. There was no centralized or organized belief system, but there were commonalities. And most tribes entertained the notion that the dead departed for an afterlife, and so funeral rites were a means of helping the spirit to negotiate all the hardships of that journey. Most tribes believed that the souls of the dead departed for a spirit world and became part of the forces which influenced every aspect of their lives. The Sioux, for example, believed that the soul departs to a spiritual realm closely resembling their homeland on the Great Plains, which they named as the happy hunting grounds. And here life was easy and animals could be hunted without any difficulty at all. The Hopi tribe of Arizona viewed the departure of the dead as a journey westwards in the sky. The more righteous found the journey much easier than those who've sinned. Where have we heard that before? And a number of tribes believed in the existence of two souls, one that died when the body died and one that might wander the after-death realms, but which also eventually died. Like other cultures, the used burning boats to dispatch their dead, mirroring the journey they would take in the afterlife. After death, Viking warriors famously departed for the Hall of the Slain. Here we see it, better known as Valhalla, the Norse god Odin's vast feasting hall. Constructed from shields and spears, this gigantic afterlife edifice was big enough to accommodate hundreds of warriors, and among its 800 doors was a wooden one known as Valgrint, the entry point for worthy heroes. Once in Valhalla and their war wounds healed, Viking warriors could resume exactly the same pleasures that they'd enjoyed on Earth, principally fighting and feasting. Each day they would clad themselves in armor and go to a special practice area to engage in combat all over again. And should they find themselves mortally wounded, no problem, but still obliged to suffer the pain of those wounds. By evening, everything was back to normal, and they'd return to Valhalla's vast feasting hall to gorge themselves at a giant wild boar, which was killed and eaten each day, and which miraculously somehow reincarnated each time. Certainly, the Norse weren't well known for their vegetarian tendencies. So attractive was this Norse afterlife that certain veteran fighters not killed in battle would sometimes deliberately fall on their own swords to ensure a safe passage to this hall of hedonism and heroes. Now, in contrast, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, which consist of hundreds of different groups, have always had a universal belief in reincarnation via an eternal cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And it's their view that the souls of the deceased travelled to the land of the dead, which was located in the sky, providing that the correct rituals were conducted during their lives and also at the times of their deaths. As always, there are many different regional variations across this vast continent. Central and northern Aboriginal tribes believed that souls awaiting rebirth occupied different parts of the landscape, such as a solitary tree or a pool of water. And this realm was known as Angea. The dead lingered in these locations until they could occupy the womb of a woman passing by. Each child then was regarded as having originated from a rock, a tree, an outcrop, or some other feature of the landscape. Curiously, this offered women a means of contraception, and so young women not wishing to get pregnant sometimes disguised themselves as much older women and attempted to look as unattractive as possible. Now, Aboriginal peoples have this fascinating idea called the dream time or dreaming, which isn't all that easy to understand or explain, but it's basically a landscape of the remote past occupied by ancestors. And it describes a system of totemic symbols in which individuals have their own specific dreaming, such as shark dreaming or kangaroo dreaming. And these landscapes are depicted in dot paintings, which were first produced in the 1970s, and they reflected the Aboriginal topographical art which they'd done in the sand and which they used essentially for rituals and as maps of where different resources were located. So original people did have this idea that it was all part of an eternal cycle, and there was nothing very special about death, apart from the old and the very young. The deaths of healthy younger men and women were viewed often as acts of black magic conducted by that person's enemies. And these were acts which had to be avenged. And so various types of sorcery prevailed in Aboriginal life. And a common form of retribution for the dead man's family was to secretly perform revenge magic on the murderer or his kin. In Northern Australia especially, funeral ceremonies can be very prolonged and last for years after the burial itself. And the tribes say that these colourful dramas employing special dances and songs to send the dead on their way originated in creation times and also mirror the ceremony which was called the very first death. And these elaborate events also celebrate the connection of the living with plants and animals and re-establish the unity of humans with the natural world after the disruption of death. I'm sure there are lessons to be learned there. But sometimes these bodies were kept for months before being placed in a hollowed out log and left to decompose. So we move on to the Near East and the netherworld of the early Mesopotamians, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, etc. All souls were menaced by demons and all kinds of evil spirits. Later, they evolved the idea of two forms of afterlife. There was, on the one hand, Dilmun, a paradise which was reserved solely for the gods, and then there was Ekala, the destination for humans. But Ekala certainly doesn't sound like being much of a paradise. It was quite the opposite, in fact, a bleak shadow realm devoid of satisfaction or pleasure, and from which there was no return. In later Babylonian legend, physical death was regarded as the final chapter of existence. The Sumerians, for example, held that if someone hadn't been correctly honored at their funeral, they were destined to return to heap suffering on the living. The souls of suicides and criminals and victims of violent death were thought to be especially vengeful. Before the emergence of Zoroastrianism, ancient Persians referred to hell as Duzak, a demon-infested pit ruled by the wrathful god Angra Mainyu. The evil spirits which wound up there could expect unceasing savagery. Some escaped back to Earth to torment humans. Duzak was characterized by extreme weather and temperatures, with constantly erupting volcanoes spewing out molten lava and sandstorms. And if that weren't unattractive enough, there were also slave pits for souls stolen by the archdemon Vizaresh. Those who resisted were still consumed by Angra Mainyu. So Zoroaster, operating between the and centuries BC, there are said to have been many Zoroasters, is regarded as one of the founder members of the Persian alchemists and astrologers known as the Magi. And he formulated a dualistic setup with a supreme god, Ahura Mazda, on the one side, opposed on the other by Ahriman, the destroyer, on the other. And Zoroaster taught that the after-death experience was entirely dependent on an individual's conduct during earthly life. He asserted that human beings have souls which precede birth and which survive death. Zoroastrianism, of course, is known as the fire religion. It remains an influential but minority faith today. And believers say that after death, the soul remains in prayer with its physical vehicle for 3 days. The following day, a woman appears, and this represents the soul's life on earth. She conveys the soul to the Chinvat Bridge. The sinless experience an easy passage across a wide bridge with rewards and comforts waiting at the other side. If the soul continues in its good behavior and can purge itself of malign elements, it can eventually expect to achieve godlike status and live in infinite bliss. But as usual, it's a very different outcome for the sinful. For them, the bridge is knife blade thin, and they're confronted by a wizened old person who consigns them to a terrifying hell where their earthly wickedness is rewarded by systematic ravaging by monsters, along with other eternal torments, terrors, and punishments. So, as we can see, we can detect a common thread running through many of these traditions. The message from quite a few of them is quite simply, behave yourself, conduct yourself well in this life, or you're in for a hell of a time once you depart this physical world. And some of these spiritual traditions echo the timeless truths contained in what I call the ageless wisdom teachings, albeit often in distorted or embellished form. And as we know, these teachings form the cornerstone of modern theosophy, something which interests me a great deal. And this year, the Theosophical Society celebrates its 150th anniversary. And since its emergence a century and a half ago, it's put huge emphasis on the after-death states, non-physical realms, reincarnation, and the moderating principle for rebirth, the law of karma or the law of cause and effect. What I will say is that the theosophical explanation of the life, death, rebirth cycle is the most logical and persuasive account I've certainly come across, and it resonates with me on a deep level. I talk about death almost every week now. My podcast, That Death Show, with the American broadcaster and esotericist Ann Kelly, and it's available on YouTube and many of the other platforms. I mean, I have to tell you, Bernard mentioned at the start that I spent most of my life as practicing the dark arts of journalism for well over half a century. And I have to say that there aren't that many journalists who are theosophists or interested in esoteric things. So if these things can convince someone like me, then I'm sure they can have a persuasive effect on other people. I also write about these matters, and particularly about death, on my Substack platform as well. So to wind up on an upbeat note, and when you talk about death, people often accuse you of being very dreary and morbid. Morbid is a word that they use a lot, but let's end on an upbeat note. Many of our ancestors' views of the afterlife may have been grim and even diabolical, but so are the views of many of our contemporaries today. Nevertheless, if you believe in an afterlife and in rebirth as part of an endless process of cyclic evolution, as I do, then what follows physical death is to be welcomed and not feared, because it's not that we have a choice. And the theosophical and ageless wisdom teachings provide us with a number of insights into the geography, the clientele, and the makeup of the post-mortem realms, because knowing something about where you're going is always a good idea when you're embarking on any journey. And as I mentioned at the start of this talk, reincarnation, belief in reincarnation, is making a significant comeback in the West. Belief in rebirth has mushroomed in recent decades. A number of findings, poll findings, particularly by the respected Pew Research Company, have found that somewhere around a third of all Americans and people in the West generally believe in reincarnation, including many Christians whose religion tells them that this is not an option on the agenda. Interestingly, many agnostics and more than 1 in 10 atheists actually believe in reincarnation as well. And America is a very religious country. 4 out of 10 people describe themselves as evangelicals, but nevertheless, among some sections like Hispanic Catholics, belief in reincarnation almost approaches 50%. So it's almost as if Christianity might be going full circle and reclaiming its original beliefs again. What I would say to just wind up this is that these days there still remains a great deal of fear about death. And one of my missions is to say that death is not final, fatal, or permanent, but try convincing some people of that. But what I would say to end is that how we die is very, very important. If we die in a fearful state, if we die with high emotion amongst people surrounding us in the hospice or hospital or wherever we die, and many people these days die in a medical setting, this can have a bad effect upon our onward journey, because some people are then held back from completing that journey, and this explains a number of different phenomena. So all this stuff and much more is in my book, Everyone's Book of the Dead. The Tibetans have one, the Egyptians have one, so I thought, well, why shouldn't everybody else have one? So I produced this a couple of years ago, and it's available from Firewheel Books, and the address is there. There's also my Facebook page, Tim Wyatt, Esoteric Author, and Substack, The Esoteric Perspective, where you can find other writings about death and other topics. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I appreciate your company very much. And if you have any comments or questions, I'd be delighted to do my best to try and answer them for you. So thank you very much indeed.
And thank you so much, Tim. I have to say, you've given such a comprehensive overview of the different versions of the afterlife, and I particularly enjoyed your beautiful pictures, which
Well, thank
conveyed all these ideas very vividly. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions which are going to follow on from your talk. I mean, I suppose with so many different views of the afterlife, I suppose one is bound to ask which one favors. And my understanding is that you're very much in favor of the theosophical view. But I wonder, while we're waiting for questions, if I could ask one myself, Tim. All the different versions of survival you've described, of the afterlife you described, they all involve, in some sense, surviving as an individual. But what fascinates me is that in many of the Eastern traditions, there is the idea that when you die, your individual consciousness loses its identity and gets absorbed in some larger consciousness, some great cosmic consciousness. Whereas nearly all of the versions of the afterlife you described seem to involve the idea that one's individual self survives in some form. And of course, that the environment may differ according to the tradition. So could I just ask you, how do you relate these different traditions to the more Eastern view, I suppose, that when you die, you simply become part of a great cosmic consciousness?
Well, Theosophy certainly draws very heavily on the traditions from the East, Hinduism and Buddhism, but basically it says that human beings are sevenfold entities. The lower four parts of that form what we call the personality, which we have from life to life, in physical life to life, and which we relinquish at death. But we also have three higher aspects of ourselves, which constitute our higher minds, a wisdom intuition principle, and our connection to the universal spirit, which we might call our souls or individuality. And this is what comes back from life to life, while the temporary personality, what we might call the lower self, dies after we die eventually. The inner essence of ourselves, our souls, our higher principles, survive in modified form to be resurrected again in a new physical body at some point in the future. That's about as simple as I think I could explain it.
So in some sense, within Theosophy, I suppose, you would envisage you could sort of have a hierarchy of levels of self in some sense. Would that be a way
Yes.
of it?
Yes, it is said that these after-death states, I mean, in Theosophy, we teach there are two after-death states. One, the astral world, which is a place of purification, where a human's astral form, which is a mirror of the physical form, goes to be purified. And then in some cases, people move on to what we would call the mental world or the heaven world. In Sanskrit, it's called Devachan, the land of the shining ones, the land of the gods. And this is kind of the paradise which Jews and Muslims and Christians talk about, or the equivalent of it. And it's from here that we enjoy a period of time of reflection and recuperation before embarking on our next physical existence. That's the view that I subscribe to, but of course there are many different variations even amongst those particular ideas.
And finally, Tim, because I'm waiting for the hands to go up, so otherwise I wouldn't monopolize the time so much. I mean, I'm interested. Some people relate the after death state to a dream state in which, in some sense, what happens when you die is basically what you expect to happen. So if you expect to go to heaven, you go to heaven. If you expect to go to hell, you go to hell. And the same with all these other different versions. Would you give any credence to that idea that all of them could be correct in some sense, at least for a short time?
Well, absolutely, because these after-death states are not really places. They don't have any physical reality. They are said to be subjective realms. And certainly the astral plane has a number of different levels, 7 main levels. And through the law of attraction, um, the bad people, if we might put it that way, get attracted to the lower level, and those who are more evolved in some way become attracted to other levels within that. And certainly in some circles, there is a belief that we go through this in a dreamlike or semi-dreamlike state. Other people believe there is a greater degree of awareness and consciousness involved in this. So again, there are different viewpoints depending on exactly where you come from about these things.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tim, for answering my questions as well as